It's going to be interesting. I think it's going to depend on how the admins react to it. There's different ways of pricing it to see, does this make sense to do? But I think, as you have more demands, regulatory demands, and investors are just so much more sophisticated now, and they want to know this piece of information, that piece of information. For the manager to be able to get that to them, I think is a huge advantage.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This is Bo Howell from FinTech Law. I am joined by Michelle Morgan to talk about co-sourcing. A little bit of background on Michelle. Michelle is a CPA from Canada. She's worked in the fund administration business for many years, both out of the Caymans and Canada. And she reached a point in her career where she got frustrated with the existing technology. So like any good entrepreneur, she and her co-founder went off and created Advanced AIS, which has developed the Titan platform, a modern SAS-based fund accounting platform. Michelle, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me on this webinar, Bo.
You're very welcome. So co-sourcing is a term that I've only recently heard about. I imagine a lot of people in the fund administration business probably haven't heard a lot about it yet. We've heard of outsourcing. We know what insourcing is. Tell us a little bit of what exactly is co-sourcing.
So co-sourcing in fund admin is when a fund manager or a GP has control over their fund accounting platform, and they have ownership of all their portfolio accounting, GL accounting, and investor data within that platform. But their third-party fund administrator also has access to the technology, and they perform their procedures using that technology.
So it sounds like it's kind of a hybrid between outsourcing and insourcing. And I guess talk then a little bit about how each of these different models is different. What's different about them? What are the pros and cons?
No, great question. So I would say historically, we saw fund managers or GPs doing their fund accounting in-house, or as you said, they could outsource to a third-party fund administrator. So talking about managers doing their accounting in-house, this gives them more control, but it's not ideal. It's really just another place to put resources in. For new managers, really their focus should be on their returns. And then you've also got kind of pressure from certain investors, especially the institutional investors, who will insist upon a third-party fund administrator. So in-house doesn't work for everyone. Alternatively, they can outsource to third parties. Now, that's not ideal. If a manager needs data, they sometimes have to ask for that data and then wait for the information from the fund administrator. There might be an extra charge for it. So again, not 100% ideal, depending on the situation. There is kind of a third alternative that we saw evolve, where managers can hire their third-party administrator. The manager will then also shadow some of the fund administrator's work, and this gives managers control of the shadow data, but it's not the official book and records. It's not ideal. You've got really two sets of books. And again, it takes resources away from the manager. It sometimes turns into a bigger job than expected because you've got two different sets of books and a reconciliation that needs to be performed between the two sets of data.
The data management can become really important. I've seen with clients where, for whatever reason, you choose to part ways with your fund administrator and they hold the data, you can run into costly conversion fees. You can have issues with the data being transferred from one administrator, either in-house or to another administrator. So I could see why that kind of data control would be, an important benefit to the co-sourcing model.
Exactly. And just to kind of expand on that, if you have a manager that has been with a fund administrator and the data is on that fund administrator's technology and they essentially have control of it, if the fund manager then wants to switch to another fund admin, it's just kind of another thing at the back of their minds. Like, this data, they don't even have it themselves in-house. So you're almost like not held hostage, but that could be a term lightly used to describe that situation, where as if the manager has the platform themselves, they're essentially just switching out the fund administrator, and the old fund administrator will end on this day, and then the new one will start with the books and records. So it's just a much easier transition.
So how did we get here? How did we kind of go from historically were firms doing this in-house and then outsource and now co-sourcing, or was it, talk about how we've kind of evolved to the current state?
Sure. And it's a good thing I'm at a certain age with so many years experience in the industry where I can speak to that. So I was in fund admin for decades, as we had said before. And shortly after I started, there were some cases where hedge fund managers had provided fraudulent investment statements to their fund administrators, who then cut a NAV based on that fraudulent information. So there was really a justifiable knee-jerk reaction to that, and really kind of a demand in the industry for more control, more data segregation. So it kind of evolved with a pendulum swung to a situation where administrators were really charged with taking complete control of information and its data flow. So what you saw was the fund administrators having kind of independent control of the feeds, or back then I'm going to say the faxes from the brokers and the custodians, reconciling from managers' daily trade sheets to the trades that went through the brokers, as well as preparing kind of continuity schedules, reconciliations, ending balances. So it was really a move away from something that was referred to as NAV light. NAV light being where an administrator doesn't necessarily book individual purchase and sales, but just takes the month-end statement and uses that to prepare valuation. So that became like a dirty word in the industry. But what happened from there, because the administrators had all the data, and because the industry started to evolving where there were just more demands, the role of the administrator expanded like quite a bit. So they became responsible for everything kind of other than trading. So the portfolio accounting, the GL entries, investor vetting, AML, compliance, the partner income allocations, correspondence with all of the investors, and, more often than not, regulatory filings, which also kind of increased as the years went by. You can imagine that if the manager wants data that isn't available in their OMS or PMS, they have to rely on their administrator to provide it. So it's not just at your fingertips. So there's a time delay. There's more work for the administrators to get the information the manager wants, potentially higher fees. What we saw evolving from that is some managers took to duplicating the work that the administrator would do. And we called this shadow accounting. But then, as we talked about before, 2 sets of books, not the most efficient way of operating, constant reconciliation. And, data has evolved from 25 years ago. There's just more complex data, and it moves in much higher volume. So it's not necessarily the right answer.
And what I've seen from an industry perspective is you have fewer fund administrators these days, right? They've been acquired by private equity firms that are consolidating companies. And it's almost like it's flipped, where back in the day, the fund manager used to be kind of, right, like the customer and drove a lot of it, right? And the administrator was kind of a service provider to them. And now you have these massive fund administrators where it's almost like the flip. Now the manager is almost a customer to the fund administrator. And if you want data or a certain type of special reporting that they don't normally provide, like you said, either they're going to charge you for it, or they'll just say, no, right? We don't provide that type of reporting. Our system generates XYZ reports. That's all you get. And so you lose some of that ability to customize it.
Exactly. And if you're a smaller fund manager, you don't necessarily, you're already having to pay for a fund administrator when you're starting up, but now you've got to pay extra for, the extra information that you might want.
So what are some of the advantages and disadvantages to co-sourcing?
I'd say for the administrators, in my mind, one of the disadvantages is that if you're an administrator that's got, a number of different co-sourcing fund manager clients, they might have all different technologies that they've chosen to use in-house. So you're going to have staff that's trained on all of those. But I also think that that's an advantage, and be able to compare all these technologies at your fingertips without having to pay for them. If you wanted to kind of investigate and engage all those technologies, it would be quite expensive. So yeah, they get a bird's eye view of the different technologies available. I think being able to compare and even go back to some of the technology companies and say, ABC platform has this, why don't you have it? Or they can move this fast, why aren't you moving as fast? And so I think that any kind of competition just is better for the industry in general. They'll also be able to figure out, what is the best system? You can't really know until you get into it. And so then if the administrators are making a choice for themselves as to what their enterprise system is for their non-co-sourcing clients, they'll have a really good idea of what they like to work with.
And what about from the manager's perspective? What are some of the advantages and disadvantages there?
The biggest advantage is really the control. It's right there. It's their system. So that definitely is a huge number one reason to co-source. But I think the other thing that we referred to earlier was if a manager wants to switch out administrators, they have the data and the technology right there. So it just becomes essentially a switch up.
So if a manager was, regardless of whether they've insourced or outsourced their current fund admin, if they were listening to this webinar and thinking, hey, this sounds really interesting, I'd like to learn more, how do they get started? Reach out to you? What would you recommend they do to start learning more about co-sourcing?
They can reach out to me, definitely. I am agnostic in terms of, who or what I would recommend. For fund administrators, obviously, I think Titan is the best. So I would be recommending that, but still very happy to talk to people of what I've seen. I've got a very unique position where I kind of have conversations regularly with the different administrators and know their different personalities. In terms of choosing a technology, ask around. A manager can ask their current fund administrator. They'll probably be a little bit biased, won't want to list any cons of a software that they are currently using. And there's not that many platforms out there. So, it is possible to just ask around and take your notes and figure out what you want. All the technology companies should give demos and speak to what you need. Because it's co-sourcing, you want to make sure as a manager that you're asking kind of like how modern, how flexible, are you built for the cloud? How can you limit and control and audit and get reports on access to the system? So that's kind of just having a system in-house, but then having someone else have to access it. Those are the extra questions that you would have to ask.
You want to know a bit about their security and other things too, right? Who's hosting the data? What are the access controls? That type of stuff.
Exactly.
Well, this is great. So, it sounds like if investment manager today, whether they're insourcing or outsourcing, if they were interested in another model, something that gave them that kind of data integrity, data control, but still allowed them to leverage a third party so they didn't have to bring all those resources and processes in-house, it sounds like co-sourcing, kind of a hybrid between the two, is a really viable option. Are you, I guess, just closing thoughts here? Are you seeing more managers move in this direction? Do you think this is a trend that will continue in the future?
I think it's going to be interesting because it started, and I think there are actually some really big managers who have been doing this for a while, but it wasn't given a label and it wasn't kind of seen as the next move. It's going to be interesting. I think it's going to depend on how the admins react to it. There's different ways of pricing it to see, does this make sense to do? But I think, as you have more demands, regulatory demands, and investors are just so much more sophisticated now, and they want to know this piece of information, that piece of information. For the manager to be able to get that to them, I think is a huge advantage. So it's going to be interesting. I'm not exactly sure where I feel right now where it's going to go, but I think it's going to be interesting.
When you look at costs, right, with an outsourced model, the fund admin bears the cost. With an in-source model, it's the manager. In co-sourcing, how is the cost allocated for the system?
100% to the manager.
Okay.
A thought on that is some of the bigger systems have a higher minimum that I really think they need to have, depending on the manager. That could be difficult. Obviously as an admin, you're using one technology, you'll hit your minimum very, very easily.
Sure.
If you have a number of clients on it. So if there's more demand for it, there's going to be more push for the software systems to have different pricing modules that are for managers that are co-sourcing.
And certainly I would expect that the fund admins would have some type of service offering that would be cheaper, right? Because they're not bearing the system cost now. So that it'd be offset by that.
No, exactly. It should be a much more economical ask, just because, yes, the technology, it's the technology and then the human resources that are the costs of the admin. So big part of that removed, that should definitely be taken into consideration so that it makes sense economically.
Well, great. Any closing thoughts for our listeners?
Just hope everyone has had a good year and looking forward to 2024 and seeing what that brings.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Michelle. Thanks for joining me today. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Michelle directly, or you can reach out to me. And if you have any feedback on other topics that you'd like us to discuss, please let us know. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you.